To start off, I haven't gotten much sleep over the past few months. My insomnia has gotten really bad, and my doctors act as if I'm medication seeking whenever I ask for help. Anyway, the house that I'm in currently, I know for a fact, has some kind of beings living in this big hedge in the backyard. They've been seen all around the house, though. I saw one on a snowy day run from behind my neighbor's parked RV to behind one of those weird trees that looks like a bunch of skinny trees just growing from the same spot. I'm not sure the name of the specific type of tree, but the main point is that you can see through to the other side pretty easily between the little trunks. Anyway, I saw what appeared to be a fat little man, about a foot tall, run from the RV to behind the tree. So, without breaking eye contact with the tree, in case whatever it was ran, I walked over to see if I could find footprints or something, in case maybe it was a rabbit. I got to it, and of course, there were no footprints, nothing in the tree, not even a rabbit or a squirrel. I knew what it was, but I just decided to leave it be, and went back inside. A few months later, my little brother saw the same looking thing run in between two of the same types of trees that I mentioned earlier, just on the other side of my house. All he said was it looked like a tiny roundish man, running, definitely on two legs, and again, no footprints. It was muddy that day, so if it had been an animal, there should have been footprints. It seems to me like they use those specific trees as some kind of portal or entryway to something. So that's the first being that I had questions about. The second has been happening a lot more recently, and is why I mentioned at first that I have insomnia, because that very well could be what the cause of this was. Our minds are fragile things when not being cared for properly, after all. Within the last month or so, I have seen this thing in my living room. I sleep in my living room because I have too much anxiety to sleep in the back end of my house. I have babies, and if something were to happen, I feel like I wouldn't hear it. Both times I've seen this figure, I've been laying in bed trying to sleep. I'll roll over and look at my brick fireplace, and I'll see this tiny little humanoid type thing run for just a split second. But it's not fast. It seems like it's a slow motion echo of a child running. I'm not very good at describing these things, but I will try. It was transparent, but I could make out what seemed like bones. It honestly looked like an X-ray or an ultrasound of a child. It was like a sheer white color, like a ghostly skeleton in a way. It had a disproportionately large head and a tiny body. It couldn't have been more than 10 inches tall. As I mentioned before, it looked like I had just seen a slow-motion flash of this thing running. It just kind of dissipated after I saw it. I've seen this thing twice in almost the same spot. The spots are maybe 5 to 10 inches away from each other. I saw it the first time almost a month ago, and then last night as well. I was hesitant to tell this story, because I had recently heard from people that talking about seeing dwarves or elves or fae will just piss them off. I don't really know. I just wanted to share the experience and ask if anybody has any idea about what this could be. I'm still thinking fae, but not sure. It doesn't feel bad. It seems more playful or curious, but I know things like this can easily deceive. Any input is appreciated. So, let me know if you have any ideas. I was laying down for a nap. I had my 2 cats snuggled up with me, and my 2 dogs were outside. All of a sudden, I heard toenails on the hardwood floor, and then sniffing beside the bed. My brain went, okay, one of the dogs is in here. And then I came instantly all the way awake, because my brain went, Wait, how did they get in the house? I sat up expecting to see one of the pups sitting beside my bed, but there was nothing. I checked all the rooms. No dogs. The doors were all shut. I looked outside and both dogs were still out there. I have no explanation other than perhaps I was dreaming while I was semi-conscious. Or I had a visit from a church grim or black dog. I specifically say church grim because my house is unique. It was originally built attached to a church in the 70s for the pastor's family. My great-grandma bought the house in the 90s from the kids of the original pastor. She attended the church and was extremely devout, so when the pastor passed away, she would go into the church from her house every Sunday and turn the heat on and prepare for service. She lived here until she died. Shortly before she died, the church had a new church built, so the old one became abandoned. My grandma inherited the house, and my husband and I bought it from her. So I'm living in my great-grandma's old house that's attached to an old abandoned church. The church still owns the original building, so I don't have access unless I ask. But this is why I think that perhaps I got a visit from a church grim. Reading some posts about glitch in the Matrix experiences reminded me of an experience my mom had about 10 years ago. I asked her about it again tonight, and she retold it to me to make sure I had all the right details, so I'm telling the story on her behalf. My mom was driving into the city one day and was stuck in traffic. We live in Ireland. She was looking out the window at the buildings and saw an old woman sitting in a wheelchair in the doorway of one of the buildings. She described this woman as a Shawley, which apparently was the name of the women in this part of the city in the 1940s and 50s who worked in the marketplace. They were called Shawleys because of the black shawls they wore. She remembers the woman looking out onto the road with a solemn expression, and my mom was particularly fascinated by her because it had been so many years since she had seen one of these women. The traffic moved on and she parked in a car park around the corner from the street. About an hour later, she was leaving the city and looked over to the side of the street as she was passing to see if the woman was still there. All of the buildings were run down and boarded up, including the doorway the woman had been standing in. She said that the buildings looked entirely different to how she had seen them just an hour before. My mom has always thought of this as sort of a seeing through the veil type of thing. But could it be a glitch in the Matrix after all? This happened just a couple of years ago. I went to Ireland to study for a couple of weeks. There, I met this large group of people from my same country. I didn't know anyone. One boy caught my attention among all of them. In the exact same moment I saw him, I thought, I've already seen him. He just seemed so familiar. I approached him and we started talking. I didn't mention to him that he looked familiar. I found out that he lives really far from my city, in a region I have never visited, and that he has never visited my region either. I also found out he arrived in Ireland after me, so there was no way for me to see him at the airport or anything like that. Then, after some time chatting, he said, "Have we already met? I was thinking you look really familiar." That really freaked me out. We never figured out how it was possible to feel like we had met each other before, because we certainly never had. And to this day, it just feels like such a glitch in the Matrix kind of experience. I don't really know how to explain it. There's this book called Fairies, Real Encounters with Little People by Janet Board, and in it she discusses stories, both old and modern, of encounters with fairies and gnomes and things like that. There was this one that was written by a doctor in the late 1700s. He recounted a time when he was just a boy. He and several friends spotted gnomes dancing in a field. They were all holding handkerchiefs between them, like Moorish dancers. He said that when these gnomes spotted them, one of the gnomes chased after them and even grabbed this doctor as he slipped through a fence. The boy pulled free and said that the gnome, which he described as having a swarthy face, reached after him but was unable to grab him a second time. They ran to their parents, who immediately went out looking for these gnomes, but they had disappeared. According to the book, gnomes and other interdimensional beings were fond of kidnapping children, who would then act as servants in their world. Another story was actually printed in the Anchorage Daily News. A snowmobiler had spotted a young boy in a snow-covered field, all alone, and with no footprints anywhere. The boy just seemed to have appeared there. The boy said that he was taken into a local hill, one that local Eskimos had said was haunted. The boy said he found himself in a city and met a girl who had been kidnapped and brought there 40 years earlier. She asked the boy for help. The boy said that the Insarat, something like that, think it was the name the Eskimos gave these beings, had let him go for whatever reason. I find these stories really interesting, and I'm just curious if anyone else has experiences like these. My family and I were en route to a beach in San Diego, cruising along the freeway. At the time, I was around 15 or 16 years old. With music in my ears, I found myself gazing up at the clouds through the car window. Suddenly, I spotted an odd triangular-shaped black object high in the sky. Given the cloud cover, it was somewhat challenging to keep my eyes on it as it moved. At first, I rationalized that it might be a plane. After all, it's pretty rare to spot UFOs in broad daylight. But as I observed its movements, I began to find its trajectory odd. The object seemed to have its pointed end facing downward, and it was gradually descending toward the ground. Trying to reassure myself, I considered other possibilities, like a weather balloon. But then a thought struck me. Don't planes typically maintain their altitude rather than fly downward? We were nowhere near an airport. As our car journeyed onward and the clouds shifted, I lost sight of the object for a brief moment. Thinking that was the last I would see of it, I was taken aback when I located it again, descending more rapidly than before. Just as I contemplated alerting my family to this sight, the object halted its descent abruptly. To my astonishment, it rocketed upwards at an incredible speed, disappearing from my view. Excitedly, I recounted my observation to my family. In response, my father gestured to a formation of jets that suddenly appeared, racing across the sky in the direction the UFO had been. That detail seemed odd, yet at the time I didn't dwell on it too much. To this day, I remain thoroughly puzzled about whatever it was I witnessed. I believe that I have seen gnomes on more than one account. It's been well over a year since I last saw a gnome. I have epilepsy, so I'm never entirely sure if it's just my brain fabricating things, but I have also never hallucinated due to seizures that I know of. That all being said, I once went to a psychic who did Akashic record readings. She told me that I was closely connected to earth spirits. I made no mention to her about seeing gnomes because, well, that makes you sound absolutely bonkers. For a short period of time, my ex and I lived in his belated grandfather's house. The property was teeming with Japanese maples and native plants. He also kept an orchid room. One day, while taking a shower, I heard the bathroom door move, and I saw a drably dressed little old man about 1.5 feet tall run through the bathroom and climb out the open window. It scared the absolute crap out of me. I let out a yelp. My ex came running in, and so as not to be taken for even more medical testing than I've already been through, when he asked me what happened, I told him that I had just slipped. Another thing I once saw might have been a troll, but I'm unsure. I have no idea what it was. Maybe one of you could enlighten me. I'd been doing a lot of meditating, about 3 hours or so, and I headed into my bedroom to change for the gym. I opened my closet, and there was a 3.5 to 4 foot naked, wrinkly elf troll type thing. I gasped and backed up, and it disappeared. Since both sightings mentioned here, I have had more than one CT scan, MRIs, etc. My seizures were a result of head trauma that happened well after what I'll refer to as the troll incident. There are other times that I've seen them, as well as one childhood encounter with my belated noni, and a few encounters with my grandfather who died when I was 4. Again, my brain has been scanned a lot in multiple ways, and nothing abnormal has ever been found, other than some white spots from chronic migraine, and those popped up super recently. I have even been evaluated by a neuropsychologist. No one has ever diagnosed me with anything other than seizures related to the head trauma, but like I said, that happened after I started seeing these things. I'm not really sure what it is I'm seeing. I just thought it was interesting. One evening, a group of friends and I were hanging out in the city. First, we went to a local restaurant, and then we went to a liquor store to buy alcohol. As we each threw in suggestions on where to hang out, one of my friends mentioned Stowe Lake, which is a small lake in San Francisco. As we get a couple swigs of liquor in us, we start walking down a trail at about 11:45 at night. First, we stopped at a creepy gazebo in the middle of the forest, and then we began to head toward the lake. I began to power walk and try to scare my friends down the path. I see a huge tree up ahead. As I was turning, right behind the tree, I noticed a small figure start to waddle away from me. I noticed a dark blue pointy hat, a red coat, and this figure was extremely short. This sucker started running and panting into a hole in the tree. It looked a little bit like a doorway. I didn't really want to stick around. I played it cool as if nothing had happened and returned to my group. And, of course, I never mentioned it to anyone. But I'm pretty sure I saw a gnome at Stowe Lake. When I was 7, I woke up in the middle of the night to steal some biscuits from the kitchen. Our kitchen is right beside our conservatory, which has a big open window that allows you to glance out into the garden. While eating, I heard some chatter from outside. Curious, I went to go peer outside the window. I saw 3 little men in red pointy hats outside in my garden, bickering amongst themselves in a strange language I've never heard of before or after. I was so stricken with terror that I didn't speak. I ran to my parents' bedroom to tell them about the intruders. My dad was reluctant to believe me, but he could see that I was obviously shaken up by something, and came downstairs to investigate. They must have heard us coming, because by the time we'd gotten to the conservatory, they'd already pegged it and were running through the back gate. My dad got a glimpse of them too, but he only saw their red pointy hats. I've never seen him look so scared before, or in such complete disbelief. I'm still completely baffled by the whole thing. This is a memory that I have about my family going to the hospital in which I was about to be born. I recently started thinking about this memory again for some reason. It's just something that I cannot find a logical explanation for, considering that I'm a hyper-skeptical guy. The memory is seeing my dad and other family members walking their way out of my grandma's house, where we used to live, to see my mom give birth. My birth at the hospital. I can perfectly recall how my dad was dressed that day. For the rest of my family, it's kind of a blurred image. My dad was wearing a black blazer and blue tie with pink diagonal stripes, black jeans, and a lighter blue shirt. I remember even how he was walking while smiling, a pretty detailed and vivid sequence of images. So, as expected a couple of years ago, I might have been 20 at the time, I'm 28 now, I was going to tell him about this weird memory. But before that, I decided to ask him first about how he was dressed the day of my birth, to make sure he didn't just go along with the memory to fool me. And yes, you guessed it, it was the exact same way that I remember. He said he perfectly remembers since he planned it beforehand what he was going to wear for the day of my birth. I freaked out so hard. I would ask myself how this is even possible. It just doesn't make any sense. So I started trying to figure this all out, and I came up with a theory. I later dismissed it, but my family used to record my cousins and I all the time in childhood with this old camera, and then put them on VHS tapes. So I started thinking that maybe an uncle of mine or someone else had recorded that moment of my family on the way to the hospital. So I decided to go over all the tapes that I had, plus it's fun watching them. But no, I didn't find anything even remotely close to that image that I had in my mind. Plus, after rewatching my life series on these tapes, I realized they started recording after I turned 1 year old. So, yeah, 1-year-old me tapes were the oldest tapes made, nothing before that. Another thing that I realized, the way that I remember this scene of my family couldn't be recorded in this weird angle and perspective. It was like I was looking at them walking, but also being careful to not be seen, kind of hiding a little bit behind a wall. Kind of an odd way to record something, right? So that's my story about this weird yet accurate and vivid memory that I have before I was even born. I'm still trying to make sense out of it. Every time I start thinking about it, I can't stop until I sleep. For reference, I live in Sweden. My family is very anti-religious, tends to always look to science and logic, and the house that we live in is fairly old, dating back around 100 years. My dad is a very productive person and is always getting new hobbies on the fly. One day he decided to start a bee farm in our backyard. When you take care of bees, you need a room that is very clean to keep out the bacteria from the honey. He decided to use our shed in the backyard, which is extremely small. The room can fit about 2 people. In the room, we have one desk, which has a couple of drawers in it. In those drawers, we keep all of the necessary equipment whenever we make the jars of honey. My dad had put labels on each jar of honey, which is a very tedious process. The labels are on a huge scroll about the size of an average adult's small arm in diameter. My dad and I were putting labels on the jars for about 30 minutes before he went outside for about 10 seconds just to grab some air. I could see him this entire time. When he goes out, he puts the scroll on the top of the desk. During this time that I was watching, I took out my phone. When he came back in, we proceeded to begin again. But from out of nowhere, he asked me what I'd done with the scroll. I told him that he put the scroll on the top of the desk, but it wasn't there. Without the scroll of labels, we couldn't continue working. We start to look all over the room, but nothing. As I described earlier, the room was pretty tiny, which is why it was so odd for it to just disappear. We searched everywhere, behind the desk, in each drawer, outside, but still, nothing. This happened about a year ago, and it still freaks me out. Usually, whenever my family and I experience something paranormal, we blame it on something logical and ignore it. But this incident cannot be explained, and it still leaves a creepy feel. There is seriously nowhere for it to have disappeared to, and that's what still really freaks me out. Even in the highly unlikely event of it rolling outside, my dad and I would have easily spotted it or heard it. Moral of the story, maybe gnomes still exist in Sweden. This story is pretty short, and I have no idea why it happened. But it was pretty late at night, and I wanted to go to sleep. Just right about when I put my head on the pillow and closed my eyes, I immediately had a vision of a gnome, a really short one. In this vision, he stood behind the transparent curtain that was in front of me, since the big window is right at the foot of where I lay. I could clearly see most of his features since the curtain was transparent. He had a huge smile, and he had closed but smiling eyes, bald head, and no beard. His clothes appeared ragged and to be brown and gray in coloring. Right after I had that vision, which didn't seem like my imagination at all, I sat up and I felt really scared. I didn't feel comfortable sleeping near the window. I just couldn't sleep, even though the gnome wasn't there when I opened my eyes. So I went and slept near my sister. Like I said, I don't really know how to explain it, but it wasn't my imagination. It wasn't like when you have a random thought or image in your head that you can easily dismiss. This was like I was watching something happen through my eyes that were closed. Anyway, I would just like to know if anyone else has experienced anything like this related to gnomes. I was really young. I can't remember how young, but I must have been under 6. I was at my grandparents', and they have an outside sauna in a building with a workshop next to it. I was with my grandpa, and we were talking about something as we entered the sauna. Then my grandpa goes to the heater to put logs in, or maybe to store them next to it. I can't really remember which. But I was facing the benches as we were talking. The next thing I know, there's a little gnome that peeked its head over and looked straight at me from a hole, where all the water goes onto the floor. It must have been only a second, because I stood still and silent, and then it just went away. I told my grandpa, but I don't know if he took it seriously. I didn't know how to feel. I was fascinated, but a little creeped out by it. Later, my grandpa told me something about gnomes living underground, as it is often in Finnish folklore, which made it even more mysterious to me. I know it wasn't a dream, because it shocked me and I remember it so clearly, and I was wide awake. I didn't know where to tell this story. I just thought it would be interesting to tell. In August of 2019, my mom got sick. She had a stroke, has diabetes, and so on. So the first time that my mom got sick, my brother was the one who stayed with her. And the second time she got sick, I stayed with her. Mostly because my brother couldn't be patient enough to take care of her again. My mom was being placed in a room that could fit 6 patients. There was this one time that I went to the canteen, and I bought food and stuff like that. When I was in the elevator, a guy came in, so it was just the 2 of us. After I bought some things from the canteen, I went back using the same elevator, and I accidentally met the same man again, with this same elevator, just the 2 of us in it. We talked a little bit before the elevator opened. When it did, we heard some people screaming and crying. He asked me, "What happened? Why are they screaming and crying like that?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe a patient just passed away. If yes, may they rest in peace." I barely heard him say, "Thank you," whispering. I didn't really pay any attention to it. I said goodbye to him, and I walked to my mom's room. After a little bit of conversation, I went back to my mom's room, and the crying and screaming voice was actually from that room. So I was kind of curious about who the person was that had passed. The nurse opened the curtain to prepare to move the body, and I was absolutely frozen. The person who had died was the guy that was talking to me in the elevator, and who had asked me what had happened. After that day, I had nightmares for a week, and now I'm always pretty paranoid whenever I go into an elevator. I don't know if this story is interesting to anyone else, but it definitely shook me up. This occurred over 20 years ago, but is still fresh in my mind. My son was born early, at 32 weeks. We were lucky, and he had few issues, and we were able to bring him home a month after he was born. He came home on oxygen and caffeine due to bradycardia. Once we were home, strange things began to happen. The cat refused to go into his room. And before he was born, I was forever removing said cat from his room. Our dog would sit at the bottom of the stairs and tilt his head as if he was listening to something. I would be changing his diaper and start talking as I thought his dad had come into the room, only to turn and find out I was alone. A friend gave him a peekaboo Big Bird toy that would say, "Peekaboo," when you covered and then uncovered its eyes. This toy would go off all the time, even after I put it into a box in the closet. I often felt that I was not alone in that house. My parents had given us an Angel Care baby monitor as a gift. This had a pad that was placed under the mattress, and an alarm would sound if it didn't detect any movement after a certain amount of time. As our son was tiny, only 5 pounds when he came home, this alarm would go off often. I would wake up, walk into his room, turn it off, and check on him. He was always fine, and I never felt that it was anything but the fact that he was so tiny that the pad didn't pick up his breathing. During this time, I would often dream of a woman that I would find in his room. I never saw her directly, but I would dream that I saw the shadow of a woman with long hair, standing and reaching into his crib. The dreams never scared me, but I did find them very odd, yet comforting at the same time. I can't remember how long he'd been home, but it was at least a month. He was still on oxygen and still on caffeine. Our bed was to the left of our bedroom door, and I slept on the right-hand side, next to the door. My husband slept on the left. I was asleep and was awoken by being shaken roughly on the door side of the bed. I woke up and looked over at my husband and said, "Why are you shaking me?" Only to realize he was completely asleep. and on the wrong side to have shaken me. I immediately jumped up and ran to my son's room. I flipped on the light, something I had never done to this point, and I heard a gasp from the crib. Often when babies spontaneously stop breathing, you need to startle them to get them to start again. I truly believe that he had stopped breathing, and that my turning on the light startled him into breathing again. After this episode, the dreams and the strange occurrences with the pets and toy continued, until my son came off the oxygen and caffeine. Once that happened, the odd occurrences stopped. The pets stopped acting weird, and the Big Bird toy never went off on its own again. I really believe that something or someone came back from the hospital with us to keep him safe. The feeling I got from my dreams was that it was a young woman, maybe early to mid-20s, and Indigenous. I'm Canadian. I will always be grateful for them watching over him and shaking me awake that night so that I could startle my son into breathing again. In November of 2017, I was in the end stages of my pregnancy. Our apartment was heated by a gas fireplace, and, stupidly, the carbon monoxide detector was in an adjacent room with the door closed. It wasn't until the door opened that my husband and I were aware that I was slowly being poisoned. I was sent to the hospital. While on oxygen, I went into labor, and thus began a very horrible ordeal. I could elaborate, but I'm skipping it for now. Anyway, 3 things happened. Number 1, my daughter was born. Number 2, something latched onto me while I was in the ER for the poisoning. And number 3, my husband took a job out of state to support us while getting his career going. Week 1 after leaving the hospital. The whole time I'm in the maternity wing, I'm having issues sleeping. Insomnia is common for me, so I didn't think of it too much. However, every time I started to sleep, I would wake up from a panic attack. This went on for the week that I was there, and about a week after coming home. Eventually, I was able to start sleeping, but then things started to happen. I lived in the apartment for 3 years prior, with no incidents. But onwards of week 2 coming home from the hospital, a lot of things started happening. I kept a journal, and I've written it out here. So this is exactly what happened and how I felt about it at the time. November 22nd, 2017. Whispering coming from the audio baby monitor. This is a common occurrence from this point forward. December 8th. First unusual cold spot. Living room was always about 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the apartment, but suddenly it was freezing in one spot of the room. Never cold there again. December 11th. The babymobile's batteries drained rapidly. This also became common. First set of batteries last a month. All following batteries died within 72 hours. Was eventually moved to my mother's house, where the mobile operated as intended. January 3rd, 2018. Never felt comfortable being alone in the house. Felt cold no matter where I was. Started living in my mother's house to avoid being in my apartment. February 17th. Mother's landlord threatens to up my mother's rent if I don't leave. I return home. Was greeted with a horrible stench, and was forced to clean my whole house top to bottom to get rid of it. Daughter begins to scream in her sleep. This occurs about once a week. I can't wake her, but she's screaming. Doctors find nothing wrong. April 1st, husband returns home. Everything stops happening. I feel like I'm crazy because no one has witnessed this but me. He gets a job at home. Everything seems fine. We live happily. August 6th. While outside on the balcony, The door handle that I had just used with no problem breaks, trapping me outside. While trying to climb down from the second floor, I fall, break my back, and end up hospitalized. My aunt moves in to help with my daughter while I recover. Months later, my aunt confesses from day one of being there that she felt like somebody was watching her and was often cold. I was drugged up for 2 months while recovering, so I don't have much to say. October 27th. We decide to move my daughter into her own bedroom before her birthday. We had the baby monitor, a blanket, and a bag sitting on the coffee table when we all stepped outside, my husband, my aunt, my daughter, and I, to see our friend in the parking lot. When we returned, the baby monitor was sitting on the floor, 3 feet away in an upright position. This is when my husband believed me about what I'd said while he was gone, and my aunt confesses her issues listed above. October 29th. A doll that had been sitting on a shelf in my daughter's room is sitting upright in the middle of the living room the next morning. My daughter could not reach it nor leave her crib. My aunt was sleeping on the couch and heard nobody in the night. November 2018 to July 2019. I'm grouping this together because there's too much stuff in the journal, but basically the house went haywire. I have several days where multiple entries occur. Thumping, lights flickering, bad odors, cold spots, toys turning on by themselves, objects moving, whispering, and my daughter develops nightmares on an almost nightly basis. March 9th. Our friend W comes to visit. In a very disturbing way to greet her, the word hello is written on the bathroom mirror, from a marker that originated from a separate room. This isn't her first dealings with hauntings, so she replies with, "Hello, who are you?" Later, it replied with, "Rick." June 14th. Our friend L asks to use our apartment to host a party for some MLM she was a part of. 30-plus people show up throughout the night. One, who has never set foot in our apartment prior, commented that the bathroom light kept turning on and off the whole night, even when no one was in there. June 29th. My mother and her boyfriend come to visit. Everyone was drinking and goofing off. Suddenly, the boyfriend demands to go home and leaves without explanation. Later, my mother informs me that he saw a black mass floating around the ceiling, hovering around me, and moving like it was pulling something out of me. He convinces my mom to have a cleansing done. July 1st, evening. My mother, with the aid of her boyfriend and guidance from his friend, performed a cleansing, drawing everything out of the main door. My daughter screamed the whole time this was happening, but immediately fell asleep once it was done. The house felt still, like frozen in time until sunrise. July 2nd, morning. A black handprint was found on the roof of the outside stairs. I lived in a multi-family home, and the stairs to the second floor were outside because the second floor is a separate apartment. From then on, we didn't have anything else happen. We moved out in June of 2020. 2 months after, my daughter asked me why we no longer lived in the old house. I told her why, and that we weren't moving back there. She replied with, "Good. Mr. Black was scary. He wanted to eat my face." Up until the point of 2008, I wasn't okay with the supernatural, nor did I put much stock into it. I was already socially awkward enough as it was. And I was stuck in that awful teenage phase of not like other girls, but I also didn't think that I was special enough to see ghosts, an idea that I would come to regret. I'd really be okay now if I never saw one again. For more context, after we had moved into this house during the summer of '07, my parents noted that I had undergone a significant personality change. I was suddenly nasty, aggressive, abusive to people who had never harmed me before, even to my friends. Previously, I was just a goofy kid that teachers didn't quite know how to talk to, but I was otherwise considered very bright and pleasant to be around. I was no stranger to moving every other year, and this move had barely bothered me, so they knew I wasn't just upset. It was late one night, my dad was away for work, and it was just me, my mother, my little brother, and my dog that week. For some reason, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. I sat up in bed to see a dark figure standing in the corner of my room, almost indiscernible at first glance. I didn't yell, I didn't panic at first, because I thought that I had to be dreaming. I wasn't special, and non-special people don't do cool things like see ghosts. I tried to fall back asleep, but it was pretty tricky, and I felt like I was being watched for the rest of the night. The next day, I asked to sleep in another room, slightly more fearful now, but thinking I just needed a change of pace. It was a fluke, and by sleeping elsewhere, my brain would reset, and I would be fine. I had not just seen a ghost. My mother thought that I was acting up for attention, but figured it wasn't the hill to die on and let me sleep elsewhere. So I did. That thing followed me. It waited at the foot of my bed all night, staring me down as I tried to sleep. I was so exhausted from the lack of sleep the previous night that I did manage to drift off, but it was a restless sleep. I tried to envision myself surrounded by white light, like the Tolkien elves, hoping that it might repel the darkness. The third day, I was sat at the table with a few friends and their mothers and my own family. We had just had dinner and were doling out the cinnamon rolls when I suddenly felt my whole body get heavy, like somebody had just added a 50-pound weight to my skull. I couldn't stop it. I slumped forward in my chair, despite my grabbing at the back of it to stay upright. My eyes just about rolled into the back of my head. Someone asked me if I was okay. I couldn't see. And yet I could. I suddenly saw a flat plain stretched out before me, and everything was gray. The dark figure stood right in front of me. And then it rushed me. It ran at me so fast I didn't know what to do. I couldn't do anything. I had to fight to pry my jaws apart, and I screamed. It was like the screaming released me, and I about knocked my chair into the wall. I shot back so hard. I was sobbing, and I could hardly catch my breath, while everyone tried to figure out what was wrong. I told my mother what I saw, that the thing was back and that it tried to hurt me. I think this finally convinced her that I wasn't crazy, that something was wrong and I wasn't just trying to get attention. I wasn't a crier. I hated being caught crying. After I was calmed down, she took her two friends upstairs with her to my room. She didn't tell me until several years later that her friends had seen it, had seen this dark presence in my room, could prove that I wasn't lying, that I wasn't crazy. The dog often followed her around the house while she was doing chores, but he refused to go anywhere near my room. He actually growled at my room, hackles raised kind of a growl. Even after we moved to a new house, my dog never wanted to stay long in my room again. I don't know if it was because he remembered the bad thing from before, or if something had been irreparably broken in me, or was now a part of me. I couldn't walk into churches anymore without having sudden, unexplainable breakdowns. I would feel like hands were choking me. I would struggle to breathe. I would feel 100 emotions at once and start sobbing. Needless to say, I quit entering churches after more than a few bad experiences. We found a journal in my room a few months before I moved out for uni, full of crazy ramblings, written by something that said it was a monster, that my parents would unalive me if they discovered I was no longer human, that it would have to hurt my family first to stay alive. I burned it immediately, and I tossed the remnants into the trash can. The scariest part of that was, all of it was in my handwriting, and yet I don't remember writing any of it. My family still wonders to this day what it was. Germany is small, and so many new things got built on top of old things all the time. We lived close to Celtic tombs, had visited old mounds and tall obelisks mounted on them. We lived next to a walled city. Buildings in the village could be dated back several centuries prior, and were still inhabited by people today. Maybe our home was on top of someone's grave. The weirdest coincidence of all was that the people who had lived there before us had developed a reputation of being quite nasty as well. I wonder if they'd always been that way, or if maybe the same thing that happened to me and changed me changed them too. Over the years, several friends and I have experienced an odd phenomenon while traveling around the state. We live in Michigan, by the way. On multiple occasions, we have inexplicably lost hours, and we've never been able to determine why. Sometimes I was alone, and other times a friend was with me. One of the most vivid instances, from approximately 7 years ago, still unnerves me. Back then, I was living in Flint, Michigan, with my parents, about a year before relocating to Grand Haven. My friend and I decided to go camping in the Beulah-Frankfort area, a journey that typically took between 3 to 3.5 hours. We were no strangers to this route. We had made this trip numerous times over the years, especially since my family owned a lake house on Platte Lake, and we spent every summer there during my childhood. Wanting to maximize our time, we left Flint at 3 in the morning, hoping to get in some early morning fly fishing upon our arrival. Roughly 2/3 of the way, on M115, just north of Cadillac, a peculiar calm enveloped the surroundings. Now, M115 runs through a national forest, so tranquility is the norm. But this calm was different. It was almost eerie. The early morning sun began to cast its first light, slowly illuminating the surroundings. Before we knew it, we were nearing the US 31 intersection in Benzonia. A glance at the car's clock showed 12 p.m., a detail my friend also observed. Doubting the car's clock, I checked my cell phone, which confirmed the time. Even a bank sign we passed displayed the same. The reality was hard to grasp. We had anticipated our arrival around 6 to 6:30 a.m., but here we were, 6 hours behind schedule. Fatigue wasn't to blame. I had had ample sleep the previous day, and with over 120,000 miles driven annually, I was accustomed to long hauls. Plus, both of us were well acquainted with the route. Our gas tank was still nearly full, indicating we hadn't just been driving aimlessly. Checking our credit card statements later, we found no gas charges during the missing hours. The truck's mileage aligned for the expected distance of our trip. What's most baffling is how seamless the time loss felt. We had no memory of any extended stops or detours. Our journey, by all accounts, felt typical in duration, but the clocks told a different story. This occurred about 3 years ago. I had a position as a buyer, and as such would receive tons of cold calls and emails from people trying to get our company to try their products for resale. Also important, our company had a digital phone system, like VoIP. There was one central number, and it followed a phone tree to multiple offices via internet connection. Voicemails were available on our big office phones, but the recording would also be sent to our emails. So one day I received a voicemail from a phone number I recognized as someone who had been attempting to get a hold of me to sell me their products. Oddly, the voicemail was something like 15 minutes long. Curious, I began to listen to it. The message begins with just static and the sound of rustling. Seems like a classic butt dial, or maybe they forgot to hang up when the voicemail clicked on. I fast-forwarded the message just to see if anything was ever heard. And yes, suddenly a clear voice. They're having a one-sided conversation. I think, ooh, these can be fun sometimes. Except the one-sided conversation is clearly with me. The person on the phone is referencing my then recent maternity leave, our company by name, a few other pretty identifying details that currently escape me. They'd stop speaking and it would be blank air, and then they would answer a pertinent question that I would have asked in that kind of a conversation, clearly speaking to me. But I never spoke to this company or this person. I did receive additional emails from them later that were clearly initial attempts at communication and not a follow-up conversation. I checked with coworkers in case somehow, somewhere, their conversation got picked up in my voicemail. And nope, coworkers and husband were equally confused, but with zero explanation, we all just had to move on. My boyfriend and I had planned a camping trip in Canton, Oklahoma for October 27th through the 28th of 2018. We arrived at our campsite late in the afternoon and began our usual setup. Unloading the truck, pitching the tent, arranging the chairs around the fire pit, and stacking firewood. I was particularly excited for the evening fire, because we had bought this massive log with a central hole soaked in a long-burning solution. Once we'd tossed our cozy gear into the tent and set up our lights and speaker, we lounged around the fire pit. We chatted and listened to music as the sun descended. As night settled, my boyfriend lit the fire using the impressive log I had been so excited about. However, as darkness enveloped us, our speaker began emitting a strange, loud, glitchy static on several occasions, something it had never done before. We speculated that the spotty internet or the distance between the phone and speaker might be causing the issue. Despite our decent cell service, we couldn't discern the cause. The erratic static unnerved me, and although my boyfriend didn't voice it, I sensed it bothered him too. To distract ourselves, we decided to dig into our Fritos and bean dip and play with the glow sticks that we had brought. I recall a particularly vivid moment when, as we sat across from each other at the picnic table, my boyfriend crafted glasses from a pack of glow sticks, humorously placing the connector piece in his nostrils, mimicking oxygen tubes. We burst into laughter, but strangely, the next thing I remember is waking up inside the tent, snugly cocooned into a sleeping bag. My boyfriend was shivering, asking if we could share the bag. We exchanged bewildered glances, grappling with our sudden dislocation from the picnic table to the tent. Our mutual confusion only grew as we discussed our last memory, his playful act with the glow stick connector, and our shared laughter. That unsettling feeling intensified when I couldn't find my jeans. Out of nowhere, a vivid memory flashed. I was at the picnic table, distressed, trying to remove large thorns from my jeans. My boyfriend was there trying to comfort and assist me. When I shared this with him, he initially brushed it off as a dream. However, my insistence and the discovery of the thorns on my shoelaces triggered his own recollection of the event. Stepping outside the tent, the scene was eerily familiar and untouched. A lone Frito in the bean dip, unbroken glow sticks, and the pack with the connector piece. The fire had burned through all of our wood, and the morning was unusually quiet. The manicured lawns around us made the presence of thorns on my shoes even more perplexing. One odd consolation, I guess, my boyfriend, a former 82nd Airborne Infantry paratrooper who usually woke up with daily pain, felt none that morning. Were we abducted? Were we fleeing from something? What caused our memory gap? While we both believe in extraterrestrial life, we're unsure if this experience can be attributed to that. This encounter has intensified my fear of the dark, and I have vowed to never tent camp again. To this day, neither of us have recovered any further memories from that night, and part of me wonders if it's better that way. In 2016, my girlfriend and I decided to go on our first vacation together. We booked a 3-night stay at the Belmont Hotel, not its real name, which was a historic hotel in the old part of the city we were in. It was an elegant manor-style home from the 1850s, and parts of the property looked from that period. Massive staircases, a parlor room, and original furniture throughout. Our first day, we did the usual touristy stuff. Exhausted, we settled into our room and crashed for the evening. Our first night, we barely slept. My girlfriend and I were both uncomfortable sleeping in the room, and we felt like somebody was watching us. A few hours later, at about 3 a.m., we were abruptly awoken to a very loud sound coming from above our room. It sounded like somebody was pulling or pushing a large piece of furniture, that stuttering of wood on wood and the creaking. It was unbearably loud. This went on ad nauseum for a while. We were totally awake, thinking that somebody was working upstairs, like a staff member moving furniture or rearranging the room. We were both dumbfounded, sitting upright in our beds waiting for this to end. The second day, more touristy stuff. We didn't really think much about the previous night. The second night, we were zonked out and ready to sleep early. This night was strangely similar. We woke up around the same time to the exact same creaking and stuttering of furniture, or something being moved around above us. It eventually stopped like the day before, and we managed to fall back asleep. The next thing I remember is my girlfriend waking me up abruptly, saying, "What are you doing?" I awoke, standing in the middle of the room in the dark, unpacking my bag angrily and throwing our clothes into the air. I snapped at her for asking me what I was doing and for interrupting me. I was frustrated and agitated upon waking. Suddenly, I vaguely remembered what I was doing, almost like a dream upon waking when you try to hang on to that dream. I sat on the bed and I explained that I was looking for a key in the room, and I remembered wandering around the room desperately, searching the walls, the floors, the furniture with my hands in the dark. I was getting more disturbed the more I explained this to my girlfriend. The idea that I was alone in this dark hotel room doing this really frightened me because I had no control. Needless to say, we decided to call it early and head home and end our vacation. We drove the full 4-hour drive home that night in pitch darkness and fog. I called the hotel that morning to check out early. Speaking with the front desk, I mentioned the loud noises coming from above our room. She replied, "There is no room above yours. It's an attic space, and no staff would have been in there at that time." I mentioned that it sounded like somebody was dragging furniture on hardwood. She said that there was a lot of furniture up there, but that no staff member would have been there. I asked her if the hotel was haunted, and after a moment, she responded reluctantly that she's not sure, but she has heard other similar stories. "4 years after my dad died, I was going through an amicable divorce, or at least it seemed so at the time. I was actually happier than I had been in a decade, and I was looking forward to the future. One morning, I woke up, grabbed my cell phone off the charger, and walked toward the kitchen. Just as I was going to swipe my phone open, a phone call was coming through, but all it said was incoming call. It didn't show a name or a number. I was already mid-swipe, so the call was answered. I put it to my ear and said, "Hello?" The reply, "Hey girl," was my dad's voice. It sounded like my dad was far away. I was completely taken off guard, but at the same time I was cool and calm. I said, "Daddy?" He said, "Yes, I don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to make sure you're okay." I said, "I'm fine, are you okay?" And he said he was. Then he said, "I have to go now. I'll call again, I love you." I said, "Okay, Daddy, I love you too. I'll talk to you later." He said, "Bye," and then silence. I took the phone away from my ear, and it had gone back to the home screen. When I looked in the call log, the call didn't appear. I couldn't figure it out, and I thought about it constantly. A week later, my soon-to-be ex came into my house and started kicking things and ranting. I tried to close my bedroom door to shut him off from us, but he shoved it open and hurt my hand. I grabbed my phone and called the police, and so he quickly left. He never came back after that night, but I was on high alert after that and finally installed an alarm, just in case he ever decided to break in. The day after my ex did that, I told my mom about the call from Dad the week before, and about my ex coming into the house the past night. She said that my dad had never trusted my ex, and always thought that he had done something on purpose years before that hurt me, even though at the time I thought it had been an accident. My dad had never said a word to me about his feelings toward my then husband, so this was news to me. The best we could speculate was that my dad was worried that my ex was going to hurt me, so somehow from the other side, he called to check on me. It was just weird that we never acknowledged the elephant in the room, like, "Hey, you're dead," or, "Hey, I think your ex is a sneaky, dangerous person who wishes to harm you." I guess if my dad ever calls again, I'll know there may be something he wants me to know, so I plan on asking more questions instead of being so dumbfounded by a phone call from a dead person. In 2004, I went to Ireland on the super cheap during this one magical week where there were insanely low fares. That's not the glitch, I'm just nostalgic for that time. While visiting family there, I picked up a Ross O'Carroll Kelly book, not realizing that it was a popular series, and read The Orange Mocha Frappuccino Years in about a day. The first-person narrator uses a Bret Easton Ellis-like voice, where everything is his impressions in real time. I found it hilarious. At one point, we were walking down Grafton Street in Dublin. We walked past a busker and he was playing Don't Look Back in Anger, and he was right on the So Sally Can Wait, etc. part as we walked by. Something about how he was singing his heart out, even though it's sort of a cheesy song, impressed me. And I turned to my partner and said, "You know, I don't care what anyone else says, I love this song." And she said, "Yeah, too bad the buskers have ruined it." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, I heard another one doing it earlier." I had been with her, but I hadn't noticed. Later, in a train station newsagent's, we were selecting supper. It was either a triangle sandwich each or a candy bar each, and another book in the Ross O'Carroll Kelly series, The Teenage Dirtbag Years, to read on the next train. We chose candy and the book. She'd read 2 pages, then I'd read 2, passing it back and forth, perfect for a late evening train where half the people were sleeping and the rest were quiet. She handed me the book with an odd expression at one point, and I looked down to read. It said, "So I'm walking down Grafton Street with Sorsha, and we walk past this busker, and he's doing Don't Look Back in Anger, giving it all, so Sally can wait." And I turn to Sorsha, and I say, "I don't care what anyone says. That's a great song." And she says, yeah, too bad the buskers have ruined it. My own skepticism says, okay, common street, common buskers, and if you Google the title of the song and busker and Grafton, there's a YouTube video of a guy playing that song in 2014. So it is a cliche. And our conversation wasn't at all original, filled with phrases that are really just filler in a way. But it still felt really eerie. And honestly, it kind of still does. Back in May of 2012, my family and I went to Ireland. We were staying in a cottage in a rural area that was far away from any major city or town. 2 days before we were leaving, my cousin and I and her 2-year-old daughter, Maisie, were outside in the garden. Maisie had one of those interactive books for young kids that play nursery rhymes, row your boat, hickory dickory, things like that, whenever you pressed a certain button. She was messing around, pressing multiple buttons, when she pressed a green one that was supposed to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but it didn't. Instead, the book played a song that neither I nor her mother recognized. Even weirder, however, was the fact that Maisie began to sing one line toward the end of the song, which I remember being something like, "I will reach the Golden City to join the angel band." Her mother, of course, was shocked, as she was only 2 years old and was just beginning to talk. These words were extremely advanced for her vocabulary, even if she had only learned from memory. When I got home, I searched the lyrics Maisie had sung, and it turned out to be what I had speculated, a hymn, specifically one called The Pilgrim's Journey. None of our family was religious, and neither of us understood where Maisie had learnt the hymn, and even less why the book had played it in the first place. We tried pressing the green button again and again, but it never played the hymn again, just Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, as it was supposed to. About 20 years ago, my best friend at the time and his wife had her father, Felix, living with them. They were his caretakers. They pretty much did everything for him, and that included cleaning him every morning because of his incontinence and difficulty holding his bowels. They really did a great job and deserved my compliments several times. One day, my friend Mike went into Felix's room when he would normally be awakening, only to find him in full rigor mortis. Felix had sadly passed sometime in the night. I was employed at the time as a cemetery pre-need salesman, but also could arrange at-need services, and so I did. I helped them to prepare Felix's final resting location and waived my commission as it just didn't feel right charging it. These two individuals had done so much to make his last years comfortable. I just couldn't take that money. About a week later, we held the service, which I officiated. It was well attended, and we gave Felix the send-off he deserved. I rode home in the limo provided for the family by the funeral home and cemetery after the service, and we all sat around for a while just decompressing and taking a well-needed break. The wife, Mary, then noticed that there was a message on their answering machine. This was during the time where we had physical landlines and attached answering machines. She pressed the play button, and the timestamp that the machine read was the identical time as when we had started the graveside service. It was recorded at 11 a.m. sharp. We thought at first it was just somebody who had missed the service calling to wish condolences. When the recording started, though, every jaw in the room dropped, and an honest-to-goodness chill filled the room. There were 5 of us present: Mike, Mary, the daughter, myself, my brother James, and a friend of theirs from across the street whose name I don't know. The background noise was the first thing we heard, It sounded like somebody was in a room with a large group of people. You know, lots of audible voices, but nothing we could discern. Then, Felix spoke. The voice on the recording was clearly and unmistakably Felix. He said, "Please, do not follow me." Then the recording stopped. We had what seemed like a recently deceased parent calling us during his own funeral service, begging us to please not follow him. The rest of the group talked about what he could have meant. Don't follow him to death? Not possible, they said. Don't follow his life choices? He had made many bad ones during his life. The daughter absolutely believes that he was saying, "Don't follow me into hell." She believed until her dying day that her father had made contact one last time, telling her to not follow his path and end up where he did once he took that step into the unknown. I always thought that was so strange. 20 years later, and I remember that moment and the stunned silence, shock, and fear, just like it happened yesterday. Nobody was comforted. It honestly felt chilling. I still don't know what he meant, but I am 100% certain that the phone call was definitely from Felix, and it definitely came from the other side. I worked at a restaurant located in a remote town in Michigan. Do you recall that show Ghost Hunters? Well, they actually investigated our place a few years back. From what I've been told, there are two spirits here, a little girl and a man. On my first day, curious about the ghostly rumors linked to the TV show's visit, I asked a coworker about it. As she was leaving the room, she casually mentioned, "Oh yeah, there's a little girl ghost here." Just as she said that, something knocked the tool we use to retrieve pizzas from the oven right to the floor. Months later, that same coworker shared another eerie tale. She claimed the spirit would turn on the radio even when it was unplugged. I was skeptical, until one particular incident. It was a bustling Friday evening, with karaoke in full swing, making the restaurant quite noisy. Directly above us is an old, condemned apartment, perpetually vacant. Out of nowhere, we heard a series of thunderous steps coming from the ceiling, as if something was charging across that room. Suddenly, an entire stack of full-length hotel pans, each measuring about 3 feet by 1 foot and 8 inches deep, were violently thrown off the shelf in our kitchen. The resulting clatter was deafening, like a cacophony of stainless steel crashing down onto tile floor. These pans, stacked together, must have weighed around 40 pounds. Just moments before this chaos, I had called out to the manager across the room, asking, "Did you hear that?" about the thundering upstairs. I had this gut feeling that it was the ghost. The restaurant was loud, but the noise above was unmistakably distinct. Before he could even nod in acknowledgement, the stack of pans was flung to the floor. The most chilling part? Our 18-year-old dishwasher was directly in front of the shelf and witnessed the pans being hurled. The shock on her face was something I will never forget. In all, 4 of us heard the phantom footsteps. 1 saw the pans being thrown by nothing, and several others were startled by the clamor. Given what I've experienced, it's hard for me to remain skeptical. The only other explanation might be a very elaborate prank, but that seems even more far-fetched, given the people that I work with.